A retired Navy SEAL and his once legendary canine have been living quiet in a winter forest, stitching a life back together one silent day at a time, pretending the old war can't find them out here. But tonight, deep beneath the pines, the snow leads them to a cave that smells wrong, oil, smoke, and fear packed tight like kindling. The thugs didn't come to rob anyone. They came to erase a witness. A police officer and her canine are tied to a wooden stake beside a towering pile of firewood, ordered to be burned alive because she traced the thread of a smuggling ring too close to the hands that hold the town. And the real tragedy isn't the rope around their wrists. It's what the crackle of that planned fire awakens in a man who swore he'd never step into violence again. A buried oath, a battlefield ghost, a protector's instinct that refuses to die. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story touches your heart, please subscribe for more stories of loyalty, faith, and courage. Snow fell like sifted ash over Pine Ridge, and the wind combed the pines until they sighed like old ribs breathing in the dark. Mason Reed walked beneath it as if winter had filed a claim on his name. Mason was 41. Tall in a way that looked built for doorways and long distances, shoulders slightly forward like he still expected impact. His hair had once been a clean chestnut, now threaded with premature gray at the temples, cut short not for style, but for survival. Because hair held sweat, and sweat carried scent, and scent carried memories. A close-trimmed beard sharpened the planes of his jaw and made his face look harder than his voice usually was. His eyes were a pale riverstone blue, calm eyes that had learned to stay calm while the world yelled. People who only saw him in the gas station line called him unfriendly. People who'd ever had to lean on him in a bad moment would have called him careful, which was a kinder word for the same posture. He wore his uniform even now, civilian but never casual, a worn brown leather jacket scuffed at the elbows and faded along the seams, a red and black plaid flannel beneath it, blue jeans, and brown lace-up boots that could argue with ice and wind. He lived alone on a rough patch of land outside the tiny logging town that Pine Ridge used to be before ambition packed up and left, a cabin that smelled of pine resin, stove smoke, and the kind of silence you can only build by refusing invitations. He told himself he'd come here to rest. The truth was, he'd come here to become small enough that the world couldn't find him, small enough that his past would lose interest. At his heel moved Bear, a German shepherd turned older statesman, 9 years old, black and tan with a thick winter coat, and a muzzle touched with silver in a way that made him look wise rather than tired. Bear's left ear had a subtle notch like a punctuation mark on a sentence written in pain. His back leg stiffened on cold mornings, but the rest of him held that dense, disciplined strength of a dog who once learned to treat the world like a door that might open the wrong way. Bear didn't waste energy barking at shadows. He watched, he listened, and when he looked at Mason, it wasn't like a pet asking permission. It was like a partner checking whether the man remembered the rules. Mason's life now was built out of rules. Chop wood. Fix what breaks. Speak only when needed. Don't go looking. Don't get involved. Those rules were his fence line, the straight wire he tugged tight every day, so the deer of trouble couldn't wander in and chew up what little he'd rebuilt. Tonight he had been out longer than he planned, following the edge of the old service road to check where the storm had dropped branches, because work kept hands busy, and hands kept the mind from clawing backward. The forest smelled clean, pine, snow, frozen earth, and Mason hated how clean it could look while hiding rot underneath. That was winter's oldest trick, and Mason had fallen for it once, believing that if he covered things long enough, they would stop breathing. Bear's gait was steady, head level, nose working the air in slow measures. Mason kept his shoulders loose and his thoughts narrower than the trail. He was almost home when Bear stopped. Not dramatic, No bark, no sudden lunge. Just stillness, one paw lifted, body angled slightly, nostrils flaring toward the ravine that cut through the hillside like a scar. Mason felt it the way he used to feel a pressure shift before a door blew inward, a tightening behind his ribs, a quiet warning that did not require language. He whispered, "What is it?" even though he knew better than to treat Bear's pauses like curiosity. Bear's ears went forward, deliberate, and his chest rose with a subtle change in breath. Mason followed his line of sight through the trees. There was no light out there, not the friendly yellow of a cabin window, not the red wink of a tail light, just darkness and snow. Bear took one step, then another. Then he looked back at Mason with an expression that would have been funny if it weren't so specific. "This is the line. This is where we stand." Mason exhaled and watched his breath vanish. The old vow tugged at him. Stay out, stay hidden, stay gone. He tightened his grip on his gloves like the leather could anchor him. "Not our problem," he murmured, and the words tasted like a lie he'd practiced until it almost sounded true. Bear didn't move. The dog wasn't pleading. He wasn't panicking. He was insisting, and that was worse, because insisting sounded like purpose. Mason muttered a half-joke to keep the fear from feeling holy. "You always pick the worst nights," he told Bear, the closest thing to humor he'd offered the world all week. Bear's tail gave one restrained sweep, ready, not happy. Mason followed anyway, because the truth was simple. Mason could leave, but he'd carry the leaving like a stone in his gut for years. And stones had already made him heavy. They cut through a stand of dense fir, branches hanging low with snow, the forest closing around them like curtains. The air changed as they descended. At first Mason thought it was just the ravine's damp, a pocket where cold settled. Then his nose caught something wrong. Smoke. Not the honest smoke of a wood stove, not the sweet smoke of a campfire meant for warmth. This smoke was thin and sharp, like someone trying to make fire without letting it become light. It came in small breaths, as if the night itself was exhaling a secret. Bear's hackles lifted a fraction. Mason slowed, boots finding places where crusted snow wouldn't crack too loud. He kept his hands empty but ready, fingers loose the way he'd been taught when you didn't want to look like a threat until you had to become one. The ravine bent, and through the trees a dark mouth opened in the hillside, an old cave, the kind kids used to dare each other to explore before parents got smart or tired. Mason had seen it once in summer from a distance and forgotten it the way he forgot anything that didn't demand attention. He did not forget it now. Smoke drifted out in faint ribbons. The cave smelled of damp stone and old leaves, and something else beneath it, sour and human, fear. Mason hated that he could name it so easily. Fear wasn't poetic. It was practical. It had a scent. Mason had learned it under different skies, in heat and diesel and dust. Bear had learned it beside him. They did not imagine fear. They recognized it. Mason crouched behind a snow-laden boulder and peered into the cave's throat. At first he saw only darkness and the faint orange pulse of a lighter being flicked and cupped. Then voices, male voices, low, amused, and sharp at the edges, the way men sounded when they believed no one powerful was listening. "Keep her quiet," one voice said, mid-30s maybe, rough and impatient. "Boss wants clean." Another chuckled, younger, too eager. "Clean like fire," he said, and the laugh that followed was the kind Mason remembered. Careless, cruel, sure the world would look away. Mason's jaw tightened. He could still walk away. He could back up into the trees and pretend smoke was just smoke, and laughter was just laughter. He could call the sheriff. He could call somebody. He could do the civilian thing. But the civilian thing required believing the system would arrive in time, and Mason had learned systems were slow animals, easily distracted, sometimes bought with cheap meat. Bear shifted beside him, silent, body warm and solid as a promise. Mason moved closer inch by inch until the cave opened wider and the dim light revealed what the men had brought here. There was a wooden stake driven into the cave floor, rough-hewn, freshly cut, the kind of thing you'd use for a fence or a ritual. Around it, stacked high, was firewood, split logs arranged with careless precision, like a funeral pyre built by hands that didn't believe in funerals. And bound to that stake, back pressed against it, wrists tied behind, ankles cinched, mouth taped, was a woman in a dark navy police jacket, the fabric scuffed and dusted with snow, a shoulder patch half torn. She was about 34 by Mason's quick read, athletic in the honest way built from long shifts and bad sleep, not gym mirrors. Her hair was auburn, pulled back once into a ponytail that had come loose in struggle, strands stuck to her cheek with sweat and cave dust. Freckles crossed her nose like faint sparks. There was a thin cut near her eyebrow, dried into a crescent. Her skin looked pale under the cave's cold damp, but her eyes, hazel, wide, furious, were the eyes of someone who refused to turn fear into surrender. Even gagged, she carried defiance like a spine. Mason didn't know her name yet, but he could read her. The kind of officer who kept showing up when other people stopped. Stubborn. Competent. The kind of stubbornness that usually came from a specific wound, an early betrayal, a family fracture, the moment a child learns the world won't fix itself unless someone does. Beside her, tethered to the same stake by a thick rope looped through a tactical harness, was a German Shepherd K9, 6 years old, black and tan with a darker saddle down his back, thick neck, athletic frame, a working dog still humming with contained power even while restrained. His paws dug at the cave floor in small, furious scrapes. His chest rose hard against the harness. His ears flicked at every sound, tracking like a soldier under fire. His eyes were dark and intelligent, not panicked, memorizing. The dog's name patch was partially obscured by rope, but Mason saw enough letters to know it belonged to him the way names belong to partners. The K9 let out a low growl, muted by exhaustion and the cruel angle of the rope, a growl that sounded less like an animal and more like a warning carved in stone. One of the men stepped close and shoved the dog's muzzle aside with a boot, testing the leash of pain. The dog snapped at air, and then held himself still, like he was saving his strength for the moment it mattered. Mason's stomach turned, cold and hot at once. Bear's breathing sharpened, a quiet vibration of anger. 3 men stood in the cave around the stake. The first, the one with the impatient voice, was stocky with a red face and a beard that grew in patchy and aggressive, the kind of beard men wore when they wanted the world to think they were tougher than they were. He held a plastic jug, gasoline, by the smell, and his gloves were smeared with it. The second was tall and narrow, hood up, eyes flat, posture too controlled for comfort. He watched the mouth of the cave like he expected trouble, which meant he had enough experience to be dangerous. The third was younger, maybe late 20s, broad-shouldered in a way that came from lifting weights rather than lifting lives. He kept flicking a lighter open and shut, the small flame reflecting in his grin like a tiny demon applauding. These were not desperate thieves, they were paid erasers. The stocky man said, "She ran her nose too far into the smuggling line. Thought she was a hero." He crouched in front of the woman and tilted his head as if studying a stubborn animal. "You hear me through that tape? You should have stayed a good cop, blind." The woman's eyes burned back at him. She didn't blink. The tall one muttered, "Stop talking. We're not here to preach." The younger one laughed again and shook the lighter. "I like when they look at you like that," he said, "like you're the last thing they'll ever see." The stocky man nodded toward the woodpile, satisfied, and unscrewed the gas cap. "Orders are orders," he said, voice casual as if discussing weather. "Burn 'em, both. No loose ends." Mason stood frozen behind the rock, the world narrowing into edges and choices. He felt the old war inside his bones stir like a bear waking in winter, hungry and furious and very, very awake. He had buried that animal under years of quiet chores and lonely prayers. He had told himself the beast was gone. But now he was staring at a woman and her dog tied to a stake beside a mountain of firewood, and he understood the truth with a sick clarity. Some ghosts don't die. Some ghosts only wait. Bear looked up at him, eyes steady, a question without mercy. Are we leaving or are we standing? Mason's throat tightened. The vow to stay out tugged hard, sweet as safety. But another vow, older, deeper, rose up beneath it like bedrock. Protect the vulnerable. Don't let cruelty get the last word. Mason's hand slid beneath his jacket and touched the small knife he carried, not for heroics, but because the world sometimes demanded a hard answer. The lighter clicked again, and the little flame danced, eager. The stocky man began to pour gasoline at the base of the woodpile, the smell thickening, and the cave suddenly felt less like a place and more like a mouth preparing to swallow. Mason didn't move yet. He couldn't. He stood in the shadow with Bear at his heel, feeling the gate of hell swing open on rusty hinges, and knowing, hating, that he was the kind of man who still stepped toward it when it opened. Mason moved on the kind of instinct that didn't feel like thinking. It felt like an old hymn in his muscles, quiet, practiced, and dangerous. The cave air was damp and cold, heavy with gasoline breath and the sour thrill of men who believed they were untouchable. The stocky one with the patchy beard crouched near the woodpile, tipping the plastic jug so the fuel ran in a shiny ribbon along the split logs. The younger one with the too wide grin flicked his lighter open and shut, the flame briefly painting his cheeks with a devil's warmth. The tall one in the hood kept his head slightly tilted, listening toward the mouth of the cave, as if he feared the forest might answer. Mason lay behind a boulder with Bear pressed close at his left knee, not touching but present like a second heartbeat. Bear's dark eyes never left the rope line around the canine's harness. The dog's body was coiled in stillness, a disciplined anger waiting for Mason's choice to become action. The woman at the stake, Brooke, met Mason's outline in the shadows with a stare that was half warning, half plea. Even gagged, she had the posture of someone who refused to die politely. Mason didn't let himself look at the gasoline too long. If he stared at the cruelty, it would start speaking to him in the language of old missions. He had come to Pine Ridge to forget that language. Tonight the language found him anyway. He eased his gloved hand to the cave floor, found a chunk of loose stone about the size of a marble, and held it like a coin meant to buy seconds. He waited. He did not rush. The moment came when the younger thug leaned in to admire his own idea of power, when his body turned just enough that his shoulders stopped guarding the left side of the woodpile. Mason flicked the stone, not toward them, but toward a pile of rusted metal deeper inside the cave where old mining junk had been abandoned. The stone clicked against steel with a sharp ring that sounded too bright in the damp dark. All three heads snapped toward the sound. The tall one cursed under his breath and lifted his chin. "You hear that?" he hissed. The stocky one paused the gasoline pour, annoyed. The younger one laughed, but it came out thinner now. Fear did that to bravado. In that second of attention shifting, Mason rose and moved like a shadow choosing a shape. Bear slid wide, silent, cutting behind the stake as if the dog had memorized this cave in the time it took a heartbeat to pass. Mason didn't go for the lighter. He went for the man holding it, because fire was the true weapon here. He stepped into the younger man's blind spot, clamped a hand over the man's wrist, and twisted, not enough to break, enough to steal control. The lighter fell and clattered on stone. The younger man inhaled to shout, but Mason drove him backward into the cave wall with shoulder pressure and a forearm across the chest, pinning him in place. Mason leaned close and spoke in a voice that was almost kind, the kind of kindness that could stop a scream. "Don't," he murmured. The man froze, confused by the calm. Behind them, the tall, hooded thug swung a metal pipe toward Mason's head, wide and emotional. Mason leaned into the swing, letting the pipe whistle past his ear, then slammed the heel of his palm into the thug's sternum and used the man's own forward momentum to send him stumbling into the woodpile. Logs shifted with a dry, ominous cough. The stocky man with the gasoline jug lunged at Mason, face red with sudden rage, and that was when Bear moved. Bear didn't leap like a wolf from a storybook. He did something smarter. He took the man's ankle with a sharp, controlled bite. One clamp, one tug, enough to drop him, not enough to tear. The jug skidded across the cave floor, gasoline splashing in a cruel arc. The stocky man howled and tried to kick, but Bear released on Mason's hand signal like a soldier obeying a silent command. Mason's knife flashed once, not for flesh, for rope. He didn't carve the men, he carved the situation. He shoved the younger thug to the ground and stomped the lighter farther away into a puddle of damp sand. Then he turned to the stake. Brooke's eyes were wide, the whites bright in the dim, and her shoulders trembled from strain, but she did not look broken. Up close, Mason saw the details that made her human. Freckles scattered across the bridge of her nose like soot, auburn hair stuck to her cheek, the bruised swelling at her wrists where rope had bitten. He saw the anger behind her eyes, and under it the grief of someone realizing how easily a badge could become bait. Mason sliced the tape from her mouth first, careful not to tear skin. Her breath came out in a sharp sob of air that she immediately swallowed back, because she knew sound could kill. "Don't talk," Mason whispered, not unkindly. "Not yet." Brooke nodded once. It was the nod of a woman who hated being told anything, but understood when obedience was survival. He cut her wrist bindings next, supporting her weight with his forearm so she didn't collapse and crack a shoulder on stone. She slid down the stake, knees hitting the floor, jaw clenched, eyes squeezed shut for 1 second like a prayer she didn't want anyone to witness. Mason didn't touch her longer than necessary. Help given, dignity preserved. Then he moved to the canine. The German shepherd's muscles quivered under his coat, and his teeth showed in a silent snarl that wasn't aimed at Mason, but at the world. Mason met the dog's eyes and saw calculation there, not panic. "Easy," Mason breathed, and it wasn't a command so much as a handshake in the language of working dogs. Bear stood beside Mason, posture respectful, head slightly lowered, not submissive, but acknowledging another soldier's suffering. Mason found the rope looped through the canine's harness, tight enough to lift him off the ground if the men wanted, cruel enough to make the dog's own strength a weapon against him. Mason slipped his knife under the rope and cut in one controlled draw, taking the dog's weight with his other arm as the tension released. The canine dropped to the cave floor with a heavy thump, legs wobbling for a half-breath before he found his stance. Then he shook hard from shoulders to tail, as if trying to fling the cave's curse off his fur. He stepped immediately to Brooke's side and pressed his body against her shin, anchoring her like a living brace. Brooke's hand found the dog's neck with a trembling gentleness that looked almost comical against her tough posture. "Jet," she whispered, the first word she allowed herself, and the dog's ears flicked at his name, insulted by the idea that he might not be essential. Mason's mind registered the name and filed it away. Jet. Not just the canine, a partner, a life. The cave behind them erupted again. The tall, hooded thug scrambled up from the woodpile, coughing, eyes wild. The younger one tried to crawl for the lighter. The stocky man clutched his ankle and spat threats with gasoline breath. Mason did not stay to argue. He had learned long ago that victory wasn't the moment you dominated. Victory was the moment you left with the living. He grabbed Brooke by the upper arm, firm but not rough, and guided her toward the narrow fissure Bear had already angled toward, the slit of darkness between rock shelves that looked like nothing unless you were a dog or a man trained to see exits. "Move," Mason whispered, voice low as a vow. Brooke staggered once, favoring her right shoulder, pain flashing across her face like a shadow. She didn't complain. She adjusted her posture, storing the pain the way tough people stored everything, deep in the ribs to be paid later in private. Jet stayed glued to her, matching her step, occasionally bumping her leg when her balance faltered. Small corrections like he was saying, "Keep moving, you're not alone." Bear went last, tail low, eyes never leaving the men. Mason could hear the lighter clicking again behind them, frantic now, less playful. Then the sound that turned Mason's blood to ice, a match strike, that rough scrape of fire being born. The younger thug, desperate to salvage his power story, had found another ignition source. A flame flared, and it met gasoline on wood. The woodpile caught with a hungry whoosh, the kind of sound that made every ancient story about dragons suddenly feel less like metaphor. Fire climbed the logs, bright and fast, painting the cave walls with a flickering orange that looked like laughter. Smoke thickened at the ceiling. The men coughed and cursed, suddenly realizing the thing they'd planned as an execution could become their own trap. Mason shoved Brooke through the fissure first. It was tight, stone-scraping jacket leather, snowmelt slick under boots. The passage smelled older than the cave, a mineral breath that belonged to a time before men tried to buy silence with fire. Mason ducked, one hand on the rock for balance, the other guiding Brooke's shoulder without yanking it. Bear slid through with practiced ease. Jet hesitated a fraction, then followed Bear's confidence, claws clicking softly on stone. Behind them the cave roared. Wood popped. Smoke rushed into the fissure like a living thing searching for lungs. Mason felt the heat lick at his back as he shoved himself through and into the narrow dark. They moved in a crouch, bodies compressed, breath loud in their own ears, the sound of survival too intimate. The passage bent twice, then widened into a shallow chamber no bigger than a pantry, with a low ceiling and an exit crack ahead where cold air seeped through. Mason stopped and listened. The roar of fire was muffled now, like a beast pacing behind a closed door. He heard the thugs yelling, panic finally breaking the myth of their control. Brooke sank to one knee, hand braced on stone, eyes squeezed shut, jaw tight. Jet pressed into her side, steady as a promise. Bear stood beside Mason, ears forward, listening through rock, as if he could hear intentions. Mason's chest rose and fell in controlled measures. He wanted to feel relief. He didn't let himself. Relief was the moment you got sloppy. "You hurt?" he whispered to Brooke, and he hated that his voice sounded gentler than he meant it to. Brooke opened her eyes, and Mason saw fury there, but also something else. Shock, like she'd been betrayed by the universe for daring to do her job. "Shoulder," she said, voice hoarse, as if the tape had stolen more than breath. "Wrists, but I can move." She said it like a challenge, like she was daring her own body to argue. Mason nodded once. "Good," he said, not praising, just acknowledging the fact that mattered. Jet's ears flicked at Mason's voice. The dog's gaze moved over Mason and Bear, quick and assessing, then settled. Trust offered in small coins. Mason didn't waste it. "Why were you here?" Mason asked, keeping the question short, because questions could spiral into stories, and stories could become noise. Brooke swallowed, eyes darting to the crack that led out. "Smuggling," she whispered. "Not petty, organized, runs through the forest, hidden in logging loads." She paused, pain flashing, then pushed through it. "There's an old service tunnel near the river. They use it to bypass checkpoints. I followed the trail too close." Mason felt the old war inside him shift again. Smuggling, tunnels, checkpoints. It sounded too much like other places he'd tried to forget. He kept his face still. "Who gave the order?" he asked. Brooks' laugh came out bitter, tiny, almost ridiculous in the dark. "They said orders are orders. That means someone above them." She looked at Mason then, really looked, and something in her expression sharpened. "And they knew I was coming," she added. "They were waiting, like someone told them my route." The words settled between them like frost. An insider, a leak. Mason didn't say it aloud yet. He didn't want to make it real by naming it. Instead, he glanced at her jacket, at the half-torn patch, at the empty spot where a radio should hang. "They took your comms?" he asked. Brooke nodded. "Everything, but I still have something." She reached slowly into her inner pocket and pulled out a small item wrapped in plastic, thin, dark, rectangular. A micro SD card. Her body cam memory. "I didn't get far," she whispered, "but it has faces, voices, and the words about burning us." Mason stared at the little card like it was a spark that could light a different kind of fire. Proof. Not just survival, but consequence. The cave behind them cracked and boomed as something collapsed. Smoke pushed harder through the passage, and Mason knew they couldn't stay. He rose, muscles tightening into readiness. "We leave now," he said. "Quiet. No straight lines." Brooke tried to stand, grimacing as her shoulder protested. Jet nudged her knee once, then looked up at Mason with a stare that felt almost comedic in its bluntness. "Don't let her fall." Bear stepped closer to Brooke's other side, matching her pace like a shadow with fur. Mason opened the crack exit, and cold night air slapped his face like truth. Outside, snow swirled, bright under the moon, and it would record their tracks in bold ink. Mason hated that. He hated how winter told on you, but he hated more the idea of letting the fire finish what the thugs started. He guided Brooke out and into the trees, the two dogs flanking like mythic sentinels. As they moved, Brooke whispered the last piece that made Mason's blood go colder than the snow. "If they could set me up like that, they can do it again. Someone in my chain moves information faster than this storm." Mason didn't answer with comfort. Comfort was expensive and often false. He answered with a promise shaped like action. "Then we go where they can't hear us," he said, and as Bear's paw print stitched into the snow beside his boots, Mason felt his old vow splitting clean. He was involved now. The forest didn't care. The storm didn't care. But somewhere behind them, the cave burned like a warning beacon, an ugly lighthouse for men who thought they owned the dark. The cave behind them didn't just burn, it announced itself. Firelight pulsed through the pines like a wounded lantern, painting the snow in bruised orange and making the night look briefly theatrical, as if the forest itself were staging a warning. Mason didn't look back. Looking back was an emotional habit. Forward was survival. Still, he felt the heat chase them for a few breaths, felt smoke try to follow like an offended spirit. And then the winter took over again, cold snapping the air clean, wind shoving ash into the dark. The problem was not the cold. The problem was the white. Snow was honest. Snow wrote. Every bootstep, every paw print, every stumble became ink on a page a hunter could read with a flashlight and a grin. Mason guided Brooke into the trees where branches hung low enough to blur outlines, but he couldn't blur the ground. Brooke moved with that stubborn professional stubbornness, her shoulder held slightly wrong, her breath clipped, pain pushed into a corner like a prisoner. Jet stayed glued to her thigh, body close, occasionally bumping her knee when her footing slipped, his dark eyes sweeping the tree line like he was already cataloging threats. Bear ran tight behind Mason, stepping into Mason's prints with unnerving precision, as if the older dog understood that discipline wasn't about obedience. It was about reducing evidence. Mason kept the group off the obvious trail, cutting diagonals through heavy fir and down into shallow gullies where the wind drifted snow into uneven ripples. "We go wide," he whispered, "not a plan so much as a principle." Brooke nodded. "They'll follow the fire," she rasped, voice still raw from tape. "They'll think we're panicking." Mason's mouth tightened. "Let them," he said. He didn't tell her the truth he hated. Predators didn't always follow logic. Sometimes they followed pride. Sometimes they followed orders that came with a bonus. A minute later, the forest gave them the first new sound, a distant mechanical whine that didn't belong to trees. Mason froze mid-step and lifted a fist. Brooke stopped instantly. Both dogs stopped as if the motion had snapped a leash. In the far distance, faint but distinct, an engine revved and then steadied into a hungry hum. Another joined it, harmonizing like a pair of insects grown monstrous. Snowmobiles. The thugs weren't hunting blind, they were hunting with speed. Mason felt a cold drop inside his chest that had nothing to do with winter. If the men had snowmobiles staged nearby, the cave was never their whole plan. The cave had been the end of a chain. These machines were the next link, waiting. Brooke's eyes flicked to Mason. "They came prepared," she whispered, the words tasting like betrayal. Mason's gaze moved over her jacket, the torn patch, the empty radio mount, and the small bulge of plastic-wrapped proof in her inner pocket. "They always do," he said, and his voice carried the weight of a memory he didn't share. He motioned them downhill toward a line of black rock that cut through the forest. "Creek bed," he breathed. "It breaks riding." The creek was half frozen. A shallow ribbon of ice with thin water murmuring beneath in places like a secret that refused to die. Stepping on it wrong would crack, would shout. Mason chose stones that were glazed but stable, moving with slow certainty. Bear mirrored him, paws landing exactly where Mason's boots had tested first. Jet followed, but his gait carried a younger dog's spring and anger. He had to rein it in, and he did, because his training was stronger than his fury. Brooke moved last, careful, wincing when her shoulder shifted. Mason didn't grab her. She'd fight help like an insult, but he stayed close enough that if she fell, he could catch her before she became noise. The snowmobile engines grew louder, then faded, then grew again as they swept a wider arc, searching. A flashlight beam lanced through the trees behind them, jittery and impatient, sweeping over trunks and low branches. Mason crouched beneath a spruce and pulled the group into a pocket of shadow where the creek dipped and the banks rose like low walls. He listened. The snowmobiles slowed somewhere upslope. Men shouted to each other, muffled but excited. The tone was wrong for rescuers. It was the tone of men who believed they'd been promised an easy finish. Brooke's hand trembled as she reached into her inner pocket and pulled out the micro SD again, as if she needed to confirm it was real. The plastic wrap crinkled softly in the dark. Mason's eyes narrowed. "What else do you have?" he asked. Brooke swallowed. "One more thing," she admitted, and there was a faint embarrassment in her voice, like she hated needing anything that wasn't officially issued. She dug deeper and produced a small scrap of paper, folded tight, edges damp from sweat. On it was a hand-scrawled symbol, 2 stacked triangles, and a number string beneath. A warehouse marker. Not a full address, but the kind of shorthand smugglers used so names couldn't testify. "I pulled it off a crate," Brooke whispered, "before they grabbed me." Mason held it under the faint light that seeped through branches. His eyes stayed calm, but inside him the story began to form teeth. This wasn't random violence. This was cleanup. "That's your sentence," he said quietly, meaning the paper, meaning the footprints, meaning the fact that someone had decided Brooke and Jet were too close to truth. Brooke's jaw tightened. "And they're still writing theirs," she said, voice low. The snowmobile engines surged closer, then stopped abruptly. Silence pressed down, unnatural. Even the creek seemed to hush. Mason knew that hush. It meant men had dismounted. It meant boots were now in the snow, listening, slower, smarter. He lifted a hand. Wait. Bear's ears pivoted like antennae catching signals. Jet's body went rigid, not with fear, with readiness. Brooks' breath came shallow and controlled, the way officers breathed when they knew panic would kill. Then, absurdly, Jet sneezed. A sharp, sudden sneeze that sounded enormous in the quiet, like the cave itself had mocked them with a joke. For half a second, Mason's mind tried to swear at the universe. For the next half second, the sneeze became a gift. Behind them, a voice snapped, "What was that?" A flashlight beam swung hard toward the creek line. The man holding it moved fast, too fast, and the beam swept past their hiding pocket, overcorrecting, stabbing into the trees beyond like an angry finger. Another man laughed once, low and mean. "Dog," he said. "Good, means we're close." Mason leaned toward Brooke, mouth near her ear. "Humor's oxygen," he breathed, and it would have sounded insane in any normal night, but Brooke's lips twitched, one tiny, disbelieving flicker. She didn't laugh. She simply inhaled and steadied. Mason used the moment. He guided them deeper into the brush, away from the creek bank, and into a thicket of young pines, where branches were thick enough to hide bodies, but cruel enough to slap faces and snag clothing. They crawled, low and slow, letting the trees swallow their shape. Bear moved like smoke. Jet moved like a knife, learning patience. Brooke moved like a wounded person, refusing to be prey. The men behind them advanced, flashlights cutting, boots crunching. Mason heard the click of a radio somewhere, hand-held, cheap. "Sweep left," a voice barked. "They're near the creek." Mason felt his stomach tighten. Coordination. They were not just guessing. They were receiving cues. Brooke's eyes flashed in the dark, reading the same truth. She reached into her jacket again and pulled out her phone, hands shaking. And for a moment Mason thought she'd do the fatal thing. Turn it on. Call for help. Instead, she held it like a guilty object. "If I power it," she whispered, "they'll know." Mason nodded. "They already know too much," he said, "but don't give them clean math." Brooke's fingers hovered over the power button anyway, temptation and training wrestling in her knuckles. The snowmobiles revved again, closer now, and headlights flickered between trunks, sweeping in a slow, predatory arc. Mason caught a glimpse of movement through the trees, a black machine body, a rider hunched forward. And in the spill of light the pale fog of breath from another man walking beside it. They were bracketing. One machine on the upper slope, another cutting along the logging road below, and footmen in between. Mason's chest tightened with a familiar bitterness. Someone had staged this like a net. "We can't outrun machines on open snow," Brooke whispered, stating the obvious like a prayer. Mason's eyes stayed on the terrain. "So we stop being open," he replied. He scanned downhill and saw a break in the trees, a narrow chute where the land dipped into a rocky cleft, shadowed and steep. It wasn't a cave, not like the first. It was a cut in the earth where old water had chewed a channel. "Down," Mason murmured, and led them into it. The descent was ugly. Snow hid slick stone. Brooke slipped once and caught herself on a trunk, biting back a gasp. Jet pressed into her leg, steadying. Bear stepped in close behind her, body angled like a guardrail. Mason didn't touch her, but he positioned himself so his shoulder could catch her if she fell. They reached the bottom and crouched beneath an overhang of rock where the snow didn't fall as thick. Their tracks above the cleft broke into scattered marks, harder to read. Mason listened. A snowmobile swept past on the ridge above, engine whining, headlight beams slicing over the chute and missing the shadowed undercut by inches. A man shouted something in frustration. Another answered with a curse. They were close enough now that Mason could smell them when the wind shifted. Sweat, cigarette, cheap aftershave, trying to pretend it wasn't fear. Brooke's breath fogged in small, controlled bursts. She hugged her injured shoulder, eyes bright. "There's a leak," she whispered, and the words sounded like grief. "In dispatch, or in my unit." Mason didn't soften. Softness killed. "We assume everything talks," he said. "Phone stays dead. No pings. No hero calls." Brooke's eyes sharpened at the phrase, hero calls. It stung because she had believed calls meant rescue. Mason watched her swallow that belief the way people swallowed bitter medicine. She nodded once. "Okay," she said, voice firming. "Then how do we get out?" Mason looked at Bear, then Jet, then back to Brooke. "We don't just get out," he said. "We get to ground I can control." Brooke's brow furrowed. "You know this forest," she said, and it wasn't a question anymore. Mason's mouth tightened into something that wasn't quite a smile. "That's why I lived here," he admitted, and the admission felt like a crack in his armor, not a confession of fear, but of preparation. Bear's ear flicked, as if amused at humans learning obvious truths late. Above them, a flashlight beam danced again. It paused at the edge of the chute. A shadow leaned over, scanning. Mason held still, making his body smaller than his name. Jet's chest rose and fell, but the dog did not move. Brooke's eyes locked on the shadow, hatred and restraint braided tight. Then, by grace or bad luck, the man's boot slid on the lip of ice. He caught himself with a curse, beam swinging wildly. In that wild swing, he missed the undercut again. He backed away, spitting into the snow. Mason exhaled silently. They had seconds. He leaned toward Brooke. "That paper you took," he whispered, indicating the warehouse marker. "That's where we end this. But we survive first." Brooke's fingers tightened around the scrap. "I didn't follow the trail to die," she said, voice low and fierce. "Good," Mason murmured, "because I didn't come back to life to watch you burn." Bear nudged Mason's thigh once, a reminder, almost gentle. Jet shifted and sneezed again, smaller this time, like he was embarrassed by the earlier betrayal. Mason almost laughed, the sound trapped behind his teeth. It wasn't denial. It was oxygen. "Come on," he breathed and led them deeper into the cleft, toward a place where snow couldn't write as clearly, and where the next chapter of the hunt would be written in something besides footprints. Snow kept falling as if the sky had decided the world needed erasing, and Pine Ridge answered with the hush of a cathedral that didn't want to confess. Mason Reed led them deeper into the rocky cleft until the wind thinned and the trees loosened their grip, and there, half swallowed by drifts and time, an old mine entrance waited like a mouth that had forgotten how to speak. The timber frame was cracked, the warning signs were sun-bleached into polite ghosts, and icicles hung from the lintel like teeth pretending to be decoration. Mason didn't call it a mine out loud. He called it cover, because he'd learned long ago that naming places made them feel permanent, and nothing about this night deserved permanence. Bear went in first, 9 years old and stiff in the back leg when the cold got personal. Black and tan coat dusted with snow, muzzle faintly silvered, like a veteran wearing frost as a medal. The dog's head dipped, nostrils flaring, reading the darkness the way other creatures read books. Jet followed after a heartbeat, 6 years old, leaner, more athletic, the kind of German shepherd built like a spring under discipline, his ears pricked forward with the offended dignity of a working canine who'd been treated like cargo. Brooke Carter came last, 34, tall enough to carry authority without trying, athletic in that honest way, built by long shifts and too many nights where kindness got you hurt. Her auburn hair had escaped its tie and clung in damp strands around her face. Freckles crossed her nose like scattered ash, and her hazel-green eyes stayed sharp even when her shoulders shook from pain. The rope burns on her wrists were angry red, and her right shoulder sat slightly wrong, as if her body was still arguing with gravity. Mason stepped inside behind them, the worn brown leather jacket creaking at the elbows, the red and black plaid flannel beneath it visible when he moved, like a quiet flag he never lowered. He set his palm against the rock wall, feeling its cold steadiness, and for a moment the mind felt almost mythic, an underworld refuge where storms couldn't follow unless invited. Deeper in, the tunnel widened into a low chamber where old ore carts rusted in place like forgotten prayers, and a collapsed beam lay across the floor like the spine of some dead creature. Mason chose a corner sheltered from drafts and crouched, pulling his small kit from inside his jacket the way a man pulled tools from muscle memory. He didn't speak in speeches. He spoke in actions. He cleaned Brooke's wrists first, not gentle in a sentimental way, but careful in a competent way, the kind of care that said, "You're not fragile, you're injured, and injuries can be managed." Brooke watched his hands, scarred knuckles, steady fingers, and something in her expression softened, not into trust yet, but into recognition. He'd done this before, not bandaging exactly, keeping someone functional while the world tried to turn them into a statistic. When she flinched, he didn't apologize. He adjusted pressure, wrapped the gauze with economical precision, and secured it. Then he shifted to her shoulder. "Tell me what you can move," he murmured. Brooke rotated her arm a fraction. Pain flashed across her face like a brief eclipse. "Necessary," she said, and it sounded like a vow. Mason nodded once, satisfied with the honesty. He tore open a chemical heat pack and pressed it against the joint, then anchored it with cloth. In the dim, Brooke's breath finally slowed enough to stop sounding like an argument with death. Jet, still bristling with trapped fury, stood close to her knee. Leaning just enough to be support without admitting he needed comfort too. Mason slid a hand under Jet's collar line, checking for rope abrasions the way a medic checked a pulse. The dog's throat fur was rubbed raw in a thin band, and when Mason touched it, Jet's eyes narrowed, not at Mason, but at the memory of hands that had meant harm. "Easy," Mason said softly, and the words were not command or sweetness, just a signal. "I am not your enemy." Jet held still. Bear watched from a few feet away, posture calm, but ready, like an old sentry allowing a younger soldier the dignity of proving himself. For one strange second, it felt like the mine held 4 beating hearts in a pocket of borrowed peace, and the storm outside could do nothing about it. Then Brooke spoke, because peace never lasted long enough to get comfortable. "I didn't stumble into this," she said, voice low, the tone of someone who hated excuses. "I followed it." Mason didn't look up. "Tell me," he said, and it was both request and warning. Brooke swallowed. "It started with a missing person," she said. "A town accountant." She hesitated, as if saying the name would summon the weight that came with it. "Tyler Grant." The name landed in the air like a dropped coin. Tyler Grant wasn't in the mine, but Brooke described him with the clarity of someone who'd studied a photo too many times. Early 30s, slim, pale skin that never quite tanned, even in summer. Dark hair always combed too carefully, as if he worried disorder would invite disaster. He wore wireframe glasses and had a nervous habit of tapping his thumb against his index finger when he lied, or when he thought someone else was lying. Brooke had met him twice in the station lobby, she said, and he'd smiled like a man trying to be brave in shoes that didn't fit. "He came in with numbers," she whispered, "shipping manifests that didn't match forestry permits, fuel receipts that didn't match vehicle logs. He said trucks were moving through restricted routes at night, routes that should have been locked. He filed a complaint." Her jaw tightened. 2 days later, he vanished. No car, no note. Just gone. Mason's face didn't change, but something behind his eyes tightened, the way a blade tightened when it found a whetstone. Brooke continued, pushing through the ache in her shoulder, because truth didn't care about pain schedules. "I went quiet," she said. "Didn't run it through county. Didn't trust dispatch. I pulled traffic cams myself, asked questions off book. She looked at Mason then, and there was shame there, not for breaking rules, but for the fact that rules had forced her to. I found a pattern, she went on, a specific set of trucks, always the same time window, always winter nights when the roads were too dangerous for regular patrols, always passing near the preserve line. Mason finally lifted his gaze. The preserve has gates, he said, and keys. Brooke nodded. And a man who can make a truck look legitimate just by standing near it. She exhaled, and her breath fogged like smoke in the cold chamber. In the cave, one of them said, a name like it was permission. Warden Voss. Mason didn't ask what she meant by warden. In Pine Ridge, the forest itself had a hierarchy, and people obeyed it the way people obeyed weather. Brooke explained anyway, because she needed the words out of her chest. Warden Nolan Voss, mid-40s, broad-shouldered, beard trimmed with the neatness of a man who liked control, eyes a flat gray blue that didn't warm even when he smiled. He wore official uniforms like armor and spoke in calm sentences that made you feel childish for questioning him. He was known around town as the man who kept things safe, the one who could close roads for wildlife protection and reroute hikers with a friendly hand. He hosted school field trips. He shook hands at charity dinners. He carried the kind of reputation that made people feel safer while he walked behind them. He can shut a gate, Brooke said, voice tightening, or open one. He can turn a road into a rumor. Mason let that settle. He'd met men like Voss in different uniforms, on different continents, men who stood between chaos and order, and quietly decided which side paid better. Brooke leaned back against the rock, eyes burning with more than fatigue. "They didn't just want me dead," she said. "They wanted me erased. Same as Tyler." The mind felt colder on that sentence, as if the stone itself disliked the idea. Outside, the wind moaned through the pines, and Mason imagined lanterns moving between trees, flashlights, headlamps, the modern torches of men who believed darkness belonged to them. He pictured the snowmobiles, the radios, the net tightening. Then he pictured Pine Ridge town, warm windows, a diner, a station, the illusion of safety. He pictured how easy it would be to run there and beg the system to do its job. And he pictured the leak Brooke had proven with her near misses. Mason's jaw flexed once. "We don't go back to town," he said. Brooke's eyes lifted. "Because they'll find us," she murmured. Mason's voice stayed quiet. "Because if the system is talking to them," he said, "town is just a brighter room in the same burning house." Brooke sat with that truth like someone holding a cracked badge in her hands. She didn't argue. She simply nodded, grief and fury braided so tight it looked like calm. "Then what?" she asked. Mason looked at the micro SD wrapped in plastic, at the scrap of warehouse code, at the name Voss spoken like a key. "Then we don't chase small proof," he said. "We collect the kind of evidence that forces a bigger door to open. State. Federal. Someone they can't buy with a handshake and a smile." Brooke's breath hitched, not from pain now, but from the weight of what it meant to admit. Her own department might not be the safe place. "And Tyler?" she asked softly, and the softness was a wound. "If he's alive." Mason didn't promise what he couldn't guarantee. "Then we find where the trail ends," he said, and his tone carried something like a prayer made of grit. In the corner, Bear shifted closer to Jet, not touching, not performing friendship, but closing the gap as if the older dog understood that soldiers didn't need introductions, just shared purpose. Jet sniffed once, quick and intense, then turned his head away like a grumpy old man pretending he didn't care. Bear did the same, equally unimpressed. Yet they ended up sitting a little nearer than before, shoulders angled toward the same invisible danger. Two sentinels offended by the idea of helplessness. Brooke noticed and let out a short laugh, rough, surprised, half a breath of humanity that sounded like it hadn't been used in a while. Mason's mouth twitched, almost a smile, the smallest crack in his winter mask. It was absurd, that tiny dog politics moment, but it was also a strange mercy. Proof that life still contained ordinary stubbornness, even inside fear. Mason rose, shoulders settling into readiness. "We wait until the torches pass," he said. "Then we move." Brooke looked at him, and in her eyes something shifted, trust not in systems, but in chosen allies. In the underworld hush of the mine, the four of them held still while the storm wrote, "Lies outside," and the men with torches searched for a trail that had learned how to disappear. Snow thickened into a meaner kind of silence, the kind that made the forest feel like it was holding its breath to see who would break first. Mason Reed waited in the mine until the distant voices thinned and the searching beams wandered elsewhere, then moved his small group out like a smuggled secret. Bear first, Mason second, Brooke and Jet last, their footsteps placed with the reverence of people walking across thin ice in more ways than one. The storm had done them one favor. It kept the world loud enough to hide quiet decisions. Mason led them through a shallow cut where fallen branches made a messy ceiling, then down into a drainage line that carried scent and sound away from the main trails. Brooke's shoulder screamed whenever she lifted her arm, but she kept her jaw locked and her breathing controlled, the way a woman did when she refused to let pain get promoted to leadership. Jet stayed pressed to her thigh, occasionally bumping her leg with the blunt insistence of a partner who didn't believe in quitting. Bear mirrored the same role with Mason, older and steadier, moving like a dark hymn under snow-laden pines. Mason stopped in a pocket of thick fir where visibility collapsed into needles and shadow. He pulled out a cheap handheld radio, sun-faded plastic, scuffed corners, the kind of thing pawnshops sold to hunters and men who didn't want their names attached to signals. It had no charm, no glamour. That was why he liked it. Brooke watched him thumb the dial, and she understood the shape of his plan before he spoke. "They're receiving," Mason said, voice barely louder than the wind. "So we feed them." Brooke swallowed hard. Betrayal had taught her that information was a weapon. Now she had to learn it could also be bait. Mason clicked the transmit button and changed his tone, rougher, breathier, the sound of a tired man trying to sound brave. "Unit, this is Carter," he murmured into the radio, using her last name like a hook. "I'm off the North Spur. Need pickup by the old deer stand near Hollow Marker 3. Repeat, Hollow Marker 3. He released the button and listened. Nothing answered, which was perfect. Predators didn't always reply to prey. They just moved. Jet sneezed once, sharp, offended, like even his body objected to the idea of playing victim again. Bear glanced at the younger dog with the weary superiority of a veteran who'd seen rookies make noise at the wrong time, then looked away as if to say, "Keep your drama quiet." Brooke almost laughed, caught it, and turned it into a breath. Humor was oxygen. Mason didn't linger. "Now," he said, and led them the opposite direction of the fake coordinate, threading the forest with the patience of a man who knew winter loved to tattle. Brooke pulled the micro SD card from inside her thermal layer, sealed in plastic, and tucked it back like it was scripture. She held the scrap of paper with the warehouse code, what she'd called a mark, and kept glancing at it as if it might sprout an arrow. "The symbol," she whispered. "It's not just a code, it's a location system. Timber lots, mill routes." Mason nodded without slowing. He had done enough odd jobs around Pine Ridge to know how timber moved. Logs became money by passing through places people stopped paying attention to. "Show me," he said. Brooke pointed to the edge of the paper where a small stamp-like mark sat beside the numbers, 2 crossed lines and a crescent slash. "That's the old saw station," she said. They shut it down after a fire 2 winters ago. Everyone thinks it's dead." Mason's mouth tightened. "Dead places are where people hide living crimes," he said. They reached it near dusk, when the sky turned the color of bruised steel and the snow reflected faint light like the world was lit from beneath. The abandoned sawmill sat in a clearing like a rusted altar. Skeletal conveyors, a sagging roof line, piles of old cut boards half buried under drifts. A line of logs lay stacked near the structure, too neat to be truly abandoned, the ends freshly cut, sap still visible under the frost. Wood in winter was supposed to smell like warmth. Here it smelled like a cover story. Mason crouched behind a drifted loader, scanned the perimeter, and felt that old battlefield part of him awaken. Not rage, not glory, just calculus. Entry points, sight lines, exits. Bear stayed at his knee, ears forward, his posture calm but coiled. Jet bristled beside Brooke, eyes hard, memorizing. Brooke's expression changed as she saw tire tracks, recent, patterned, not the random wander of hikers. "They're still using it," she whispered. And there was grief in it too, because it meant Tyler Grant hadn't vanished into nowhere. He'd likely vanished into someone's system. Mason motioned them to move low. They slipped beneath a broken catwalk and into the shadow of the mill's loading bay, where the wind couldn't quite reach, and the air smelled of oil, wet metal, and something faintly chemical that didn't belong in honest lumber. There were crates stacked against the far wall, not the rough wooden pallets mills used, but sealed boxes wrapped in dull gray sheeting. Mason brushed snow off one corner and felt the weight of it with his fingers. Too heavy for simple supplies, too careful for something harmless. Brooke pulled out her phone, but didn't turn on service. She kept it in airplane mode and opened the camera only, the screen glow tucked into her palm like a small moon she didn't want the forest to notice. "Cereals," she whispered, and started filming. Mason used the tip of his knife to lift a torn edge of the wrapping. Under it, a thin layer of metal flashed, lead-like sheet, the kind used to block scans, hide contents, keep secrets quiet, even from machines. Brooke's eyes widened. "They're shielding it," she breathed. "This isn't just smuggling cigarettes or booze." Mason didn't answer. He found a ledger in a dented lockbox behind the crates. Paper, not digital, because paper didn't get hacked, but it did get burned. The pages were filled with coded numbers, dates, and initials, and at the top of several entries was the same mark Brooke had shown him. 2 crossed lines, crescent slash. The handwriting was steady and arrogant, like whoever wrote it believed no one would ever read it in the wrong hands. Brooke filmed each page carefully, then photographed close-ups of the serial number plates stamped into the crate corners. She pulled out a small pocket tool and scraped a tiny paint fleck from one label, sealing it in a plastic sleeve. "Chain of custody," she murmured, the cop part of her refusing to die even when her faith in the badge had been gutted. Mason watched her, and in that moment he saw what she really was beneath the uniform. A woman who had learned, the hard way, that truth didn't survive without structure. Bear and Jet stood shoulder to shoulder behind them like twin sentinels, both dogs vibrating with that specific anger working animals carried when they were forced to witness helplessness. Their tails stayed low, their eyes stayed bright, their dignity stayed intact. Then Bear froze. Not dramatic, just a sudden stillness that made the air tighten. Mason followed his gaze through the broken slats of the bay door and saw a single headlight moving slow through the trees, an approaching vehicle, careful, not lost. Mason's hand lifted, halt. Brooke stopped breathing like it was a skill. Jet's chest rumbled with a silent growl. The headlight cut closer, then a second light appeared as the vehicle turned, an old pickup, dark, mud-caked, tires fitted for winter roads. It rolled into the clearing and stopped near the stacks. The engine stayed running, low and patient. A man stepped out. He moved with the stiffness of someone who'd been hurt before, and refused to admit it. Early 40s, maybe, tall and broad in the shoulders, though not bulky, strength from years of function, not vanity. He wore a thick work jacket smeared with grease along the cuffs and a dark knit cap pulled low. A scruffy beard shadowed his jaw, and his face had the weathered angles of a man who spent more time with machines than mirrors. His hands were bare despite the cold, knuckles nicked, fingers stained with oil, the hands of a mechanic who'd learned that gloves were sometimes a lie. He carried a flashlight, but didn't shine it around like a tourist. He aimed it at specific points: locks, tracks, crate corners, checking like a man counting teeth. Brooks' eyes narrowed, Mason's body tightened. The man paused by the ledger box, as if he already knew it existed. Mason recognized the posture before the face fully registered, the slight forward lean, the controlled scanning, the habit of listening between sounds. SEAL training left fingerprints on the body even when the mind tried to retire. Mason whispered, almost not believing it, "Eli." The man's head snapped toward the bay, flashlight shifting, and his voice came low and flat. "Show yourself," he said, "or I start shooting the shadows." Brooks' jaw clenched. Mason rose slowly into view, hands visible but not submissive, bare at his leg like a dark promise. The man's flashlight locked on Mason's jacket, then on Bear's silvered muzzle, and the tension in his shoulders cracked into recognition. "Mason Reed," the man said, and his tone carried equal parts relief and bitterness, like finding an old brother in the wrong church. Eli Parker had once been the kind of teammate who laughed too loud to keep fear from settling in. Now his humor lived deeper, buried under caution, as if a bad mission had taught him that jokes were expensive. His eyes, brown, sharp, looked tired around the edges, the tired of a man who'd watched good people get betrayed by paperwork. "What the hell are you doing here?" Eli asked, and the question wasn't curiosity, it was warning. Mason didn't waste words. "Stopping a burn?" he said. Brooks stepped into the edge of the light, face pale, wrists bandaged, uniform torn. Eli's gaze flicked over her injuries with quick professional assessment and then down to Jet, who stood rigid at her side like a living courtroom exhibit. Eli's mouth tightened. "They're really doing it," he murmured, not surprised, just sickened. "They're cleaning witnesses." Brooks' voice came quiet and lethal. "You know about this," she said. Eli's jaw flexed. "I know about Voss," he said. "And I know he's not just moving contraband. He's selling information, routes, patrol shifts, names. Anybody who gets too close?" Eli made a slicing motion across his throat with two fingers, blunt as a hammer. "He farms fear. It pays better than honest work." Mason's eyes narrowed. "Why are you here?" Eli's laugh came out humorless. "Because my shop keeps fixing trucks that shouldn't exist," he said. "Because I've been seeing the same mark on parts orders. And because a guy like Voss doesn't just smuggle, he recruits." Eli looked at Mason like confession hurt. "He tried me." Brooks' expression sharpened. "And?" Eli's eyes flashed. "And I said no," he snapped, then lowered his voice. "But no doesn't end the conversation with people like that. It just changes the method." Before Mason could answer, a second engine sound rose at the far edge of the clearing. Another vehicle, moving faster. Headlights flickered through trees. Eli's face changed instantly. "We don't have time," he said. "They'll sweep this place the moment your fake radio call pulls their net." Brooks' breath caught. "You heard the call," she realized. Eli didn't deny it. "They've got ears everywhere," he said, "and Voss has friends who wear official patches." Mason's mind clicked into motion. They already had what mattered: video of the ledger, serial numbers, lead shielding, evidence with a spine. "Move," Mason ordered softly. He grabbed the ledger box itself, proof they couldn't erase by burning a phone, and shoved it into his pack. Brooke kept filming as she backed away, grabbing one more close-up of a stamped crate seal. The dogs moved with them, Bear guarding Mason's left, Jet guarding Brooke's right, a mirrored formation that felt almost mythic, like twin hounds escorting mortals out of an underworld warehouse of sins. They slipped behind the log stacks as the new headlights brightened the clearing. A voice called out, male, rough, confident, too far to identify, but close enough to tell. Hunters had arrived. Eli led them toward a service trench behind the mill where old scrap pipes and half-buried beams offered cover. "This way," he hissed. "There's a culvert that runs to the creek." Brooke stumbled once, shoulder giving out for a breath, and Jet bumped her hip hard enough to correct her balance like a stern coach. "I'm fine," she whispered through her teeth. Jet sneezed again, of all things, then huffed as if offended by his own timing. Bear's ears flicked like he was laughing without sound. Mason's mouth tightened into the smallest almost smile, because even in terror, dogs insisted on being ridiculous for half a second. Then the gunshot cracked. Not a spray, one sharp report, aimed by someone who wasn't panicking. Eli jerked, stumbled, and slapped a hand against his side. Dark blood immediately soaked into the fabric near his ribs. It wasn't a clean hit, not fatal, but it was a tax paid to the gods of truth. Eli grunted, anger flaring through pain. "Just a graze," he lied badly, because men always lied like that when it wasn't. Mason caught him by the shoulder and hauled him forward. "You bleed later," Mason muttered. "Run now." They dropped into the culvert mouth, cold water murmuring under thin ice, and crawled through the dark like fugitives in a story the forest refused to forget. Behind them, the abandoned sawmill filled with moving lights, and the woodpile of secrets waited. Still stacked, still ready to burn, only now the hunters knew their prey had teeth, and proof had already slipped into the night. Snow kept falling like ash that hadn't decided whether it belonged to fire or forgiveness. And the forest of Pine Ridge looked holy in the way a battlefield looks holy from far away. Beautiful until you step close enough to count the damage. Mason Reed moved with Bear at heel and Brooke Carter with Jet at her side, and behind them Eli Parker bled in quiet, stubborn drops that the snow tried to swallow like a guilty witness. Eli was built like a man who'd spent years forcing engines to obey him. Tall, broad through the chest, grease under the nails even on days he wore clean gloves. And his face carried that specific SEAL-era weathering. Sharp cheekbones, a jaw that could clench through anything, and eyes that still watched corners, like corners were predators. He'd taken a grazing shot near the ribs. Not a Hollywood wound, not a clean one either. It was the kind that didn't kill you quickly, but could ruin you slowly if the cold got the vote. Mason didn't let the cold vote. He pushed them through the creek culvert, out into a stand of old firs where the wind had been broken into smaller pieces, and then into a narrow gully where the snow lay deep enough to muffle steps but shallow enough to betray them if anyone brought headlights. Mason's worn brown leather jacket creaked each time he twisted, old seams telling old truths. And the red and black plaid beneath it flashed in the gaps like a warning flag nobody else could see. Brooke noticed everything because pain made her sharper. Oh, she watched the way Mason picked routes that weren't routes, how he found shelter pockets without hesitation, how he guided them toward boulders that blocked sight lines and away from ridges that carried silhouettes. It wasn't luck. It was preparation. Too much of it. "How do you know all these exits?" Brooke finally asked, breath fogging hard, voice clipped by cold, and the ache in her shoulder that had never stopped screaming since the stake. She was 34 and built athletic in a practical way, 5'8"-ish, strong legs from long shifts and foot chases, auburn hair pulled back, but now half loose with frost clinging near her temples. Her freckles looked like ash scattered across pale winter skin, and her hazel eyes stayed steady even when her body wanted to fold. Her toughness didn't come from arrogance. It came from the kind of childhood that taught a person to become their own backup plan. Mason didn't answer at first. He glanced at Bear, 9 years old now, thick black and tan coat, silvering at the muzzle, one ear slightly notched, like a punctuation mark carved by duty. Bear's eyes were the color of old debt, calm and counting. Jet, 6 and still muscled like a spring-loaded machine, kept his chest close to Brooks' leg, ears flicking at distant sounds, mouth shut because he'd learned silence was survival. The two dogs moved like mismatched brothers, forced to share a room, grumpy, respectful, secretly grateful. Jet sneezed once, sharp and offended, then looked around as if to blame Winter for entering his nose without permission. Bear gave the faintest huff that might have been a laugh. Brooks' lips twitched for half a second, and the humor didn't fix anything, but it kept her from drowning in it. Mason finally said, "Because I needed to disappear." His voice was quiet, not dramatic. "And I practiced." Brooke didn't like that answer, because it implied he'd been expecting the world to rot. Eli stumbled, caught himself, and muttered through clenched teeth, "He's not wrong." Mason found a shallow overhang behind a slanted rock slab, nothing cinematic, just enough to cut wind, and pulled a small kit from his pack, like a man revealing a private religion. Gauze, antiseptic wipes, a compact heat pack, and a roll of tape that looked as old as the lies in this town. Brooks' suspicion sharpened. "You carry all that?" Mason's mouth tightened. "I carry what the system won't." He cleaned Eli's wound fast, hands steady, not gentle sweet, but competent careful, the kind of care that said, "Live first, feel later." Eli hissed once, then tried to crack a joke and failed halfway, which told Brooke more about him than any biography could. He used humor like a wrench to keep parts from rattling apart. When Mason finished, he pressed a heat pack against Eli's side and wrapped it tight under the jacket. "Keep moving," Mason said. "If we stop, the cold gets votes." Brooke studied him again. Men didn't build lives like this without having been betrayed by something bigger than weather. "You trusted someone," she said, not a question. Mason's eyes went distant for a heartbeat, the look of a man watching a door close in his memory. "I trusted a chain," he replied. "Chains break." Brooke felt that land in her ribs. It matched the ugly new math she'd been doing since the cave. The truth wasn't being hunted by criminals at the edge of town. It was being hunted by someone sitting comfortably at the center of the table, passing salt like nothing was wrong. They moved again, deeper into old growth where trees stood like cathedral pillars. Behind them the night carried faint mechanical whines, snowmobiles hunting the way wolves hunted now, with engines instead of teeth. Mason angled them toward a ravine cut, then up to a weather-chewed wooden bridge that spanned a narrow ice chasm. It wasn't a proud bridge, it was an old service crossing, boards warped, rails half gone, the kind of structure the county forgot existed and that smugglers loved because forgotten meant unmonitored. Mason tested a plank with his boot and didn't like the answer. "Single file," he murmured. Bear went first, paws placed like he was reading a map written in splinters. Mason followed, then Brooke with Jet close enough that their fur nearly touched. Eli last, jaw clenched, eyes hard with pain and pride. Halfway across, the engines behind them grew louder, and flashlights began to flicker between trees like angry fireflies. A voice shouted, too far to name, close enough to promise violence. Mason didn't run. He moved faster with discipline, and discipline mattered because panic made noise and noise made targets. They made it off the bridge as the first snowmobile burst into view. The rider was heavy-set, wearing a dark helmet and an orange vest like a parody of safety, and he barreled onto the bridge without checking what winter had done to wood. Mason's body tensed, ready to fight, but the forest chose another method first. The plank near the center gave with a wet crack. The snowmobile tilted, the rider yelped, and the whole machine bucked sideways. The man slid off and dropped through a partial gap, caught by broken boards and a ledge, not dead, but hanging and howling, legs kicking above black water. Another rider skidded to a stop, cursing, trying to reach him. It was a perfect pause, a gift, and a darker Mason, the one the war had trained, could have turned that pause into an ending. Brooke saw Mason's shoulders change. She saw the old war inside him offer its simplest answer. Then she saw him refuse it. Mason stepped forward, eyes cold, and instead of finishing the fallen man, he kicked the snowmobile's throttle housing and snapped the cable with a clean, practiced motion. The machine died, useless. He looked at the hanging thug once, expression unreadable. "You live," Mason said, voice low, "because I don't bring fire home." Then he pulled them into the trees before the others could decide whether to rescue their friend or chase their prey. Brooke's breath came out shaking, not from fear of the chase, but from the shock of restraint. "Why?" she whispered as they ran. Mason didn't look back. "Because if I start choosing who deserves oxygen," he answered, "I'll never stop." That was not a moral speech. It was a confession. They ran until the engines faded and the forest thickened into safer darkness. When they finally stopped, it was inside the skeleton of an old hunting blind tucked into a grove of firs, half collapsed and crusted with snow. Mason had reinforced it at some point. Brooke noticed the newer nails, the hidden tarp layer, the wind block. Another prepared place. Another reason to suspect him. Mason didn't deny it when her eyes narrowed. He simply shrugged, like a man too tired to pretend he hadn't been afraid of the world for a long time. In the blind's dim shelter, Brooke pulled out the micro SD card, the body cam evidence that had survived rope, fire, and pursuit. She didn't have a laptop. Mason did. Not a fancy one. An old ruggedized field tablet with a cracked corner and a protective casing that looked like it had been dropped off a cliff and insulted afterward. Brooke stared at it. "You've really been planning for betrayal," she murmured. Mason's mouth twitched, almost humor, almost pain. "I've been planning for weather," he said. "People are worse weather." Brooke inserted the card and played the latest clip with the sound barely audible. The video showed shaky movement, her own body cam swinging as she pushed through brush days earlier. Then a shadowed figure stepping into frame. Warden Voss. Even on a grainy recording, his presence radiated authority, like a cold lantern. He was mid-40s, lean, with a trimmed beard, and a face that looked carved by wind and entitlement. His eyes were the kind that stayed calm when other people flinched, and his uniform jacket sat perfectly even in the woods, as if he believed dirt should respect him. Brooke watched herself speak to him in the clip, professional, cautious, asking about timber roots and a missing accountant. Voss answered with smooth patience, then stepped closer and lowered his voice. The audio caught it clearly. "You're chasing the wrong trail, officer." Then another voice entered, off-camera, warm and easy, the kind of voice that belonged at a community fundraiser. It wasn't the voice of a thug. It was the voice of a man who'd never been told no at dinner. "Caleb," the voice said, using Voss's first name like a leash disguised as friendship. "Is she a problem?" Brooke's stomach clenched. The voice had polished vowels, relaxed confidence, the tone of someone used to signing papers that became reality for other people. Voss replied, "She's persistent." The voice chuckled softly. "Persistent gets people killed in winter," it said, and the laugh wasn't a joke. It was a verdict. Brooke froze the clip and stared at Mason like the tablet had grown teeth. "That's someone in town," she whispered. "That's power." Mason listened again, eyes narrowed, and something in his face tightened, the way a scar tightened before a storm. "Not fringe," he said. "Center." Brooke's hands began to tremble, not from cold now, but from the grief of realization. The enemy wasn't just in the woods. The enemy sat in the warm places. Eli leaned back against a support beam, pale under stubble, and muttered, "Told you, Voss doesn't run alone." Brooke replayed the voice 3 times, trying to match it to memory, to meetings, to public speeches, but the sound was both familiar and slippery, the way corruption loved to be. Jet pressed against her boot, steady and stubborn, like a living brace. Her shoulder throbbed, heat and ache turning her vision sharp at the edges. She swallowed hard and tried to stand, but her arm failed her halfway. Pain surged like a wave. For the first time, Brooke's eyes filled, not with fear, but with the humiliation of needing help while being hunted. She clenched her jaw until it hurt, refusing to cry. Jet leaned harder, body warm, anchoring her. Bear moved closer too, not touching her, just occupying space like a quiet wall. Mason watched it all, and something in him shifted. He had spent years training himself to be unnecessary. Now the forest had handed him a different assignment, not to be a weapon, but to be a person. The difference terrified him more than gunfire ever had. He knelt beside Brooke, careful not to crowd her pride. "Your shoulder," he said softly. Brooke tried to laugh, and it came out brittle. "It's fine." Mason didn't argue. He simply slid a heat pack from his kit and offered it like an apology. "Let it vote less," he said. Brooke took it, and in that small exchange, heat pack to trembling hands, something began to untrap in Mason's chest. Not peace, not romance, just the first crack in his vow to stay alone. Outside, far off, a snowmobile engine revved again, frustrated, searching. The chase hadn't ended. It had only changed shape. Mason leaned close, voice steady as stone. "We don't go back to town," he said. "Not yet. We don't call anyone who wears a local badge. We move where I can control the ground." Brooke looked at him, and suspicion and necessity wrestled in her gaze. "You have more places," she said. Mason didn't deny it. He just nodded once, a tired admission. Eli winced, pushing himself upright. "Whatever place he means," Eli said, attempting humor through pain, "I'd like it to include a chair and fewer bullets." Bear huffed as if agreeing with the concept of furniture. Jet sneezed again, offended by the world, and Brooke, despite everything, let out a short laugh that sounded like a sob, trying to remember how to be human. Mason rose, signaled the dogs, and shouldered his pack with the ledger and the evidence like it was a burden the gods had finally decided he was strong enough to carry. "We move," he said. "Now." And as they slipped out into the ash-falling snow, the forest around them felt less like a hiding place and more like a labyrinth, where every trap had 2 faces, one meant for criminals and one meant for the parts of your own heart you thought you'd buried too deep to be found. Ice laid itself over the river like a mirror that refused to show mercy, and the wind off the water kept whispering the same ancient warning. Anything that looks smooth in winter is usually a lie. Mason Reed brought the group down through a seam of spruce and rock toward Frozen Fork Landing, a forgotten dock where old logging roads met the river's hard white spine. Bear moved at his heel with the patient weight of 9 years and too many quiet rescues, black and tan coat dusted with frost, muzzle silvered like a veteran's badge, nobody pinned on him. Brooke Carter followed with her jaw clenched against pain, auburn hair tucked back but constantly escaping, freckles stark against winter-pale skin, hazel eyes scanning angles the way some people scan prayer beads. Jet stayed pressed to her, 6 years old and built like a coiled spring, every muscle disciplined into silence, his breath held tight when Mason held up a fist. Eli Parker lagged behind them, wounded but stubborn, the kind of man who treated pain like an annoying engine noise. Something you didn't like, but something you could still drive through if you kept the RPM steady. He was pale under his stubble, yet his eyes stayed sharp and his humor, thin as wire, kept trying to stitch the group together. "If this dock has hot coffee," he whispered, "I'll convert to whatever religion it's selling." Bear's ear flicked as if unimpressed by spiritual bargaining, and Jet's nose twitched like he was laughing without permission. Mason didn't smile, but something inside him loosened a fraction, a tiny crack in the old vow that said he must never need anyone, and never let anyone need him. They reached a low ridge above the dock and settled into shadow. Below them the landing looked abandoned, rotted posts, a half-buried winch, tire ruts filled with frozen slush, until headlights bled through trees and turned the snow into a sheet of bruised light. A convoy rolled in, 2 logging trucks with chains clinking softly, beds stacked high with cut timber that looked ordinary to anyone who didn't know how criminals learned to hide in plain sight. Mason lifted his phone and started filming from cover, zooming on license plates, marking the sequence, counting spacing like it was a patrol in hostile territory. Brooke's hands trembled once as she recorded too, not from fear, but from fury, the kind of fury that came when the world tried to punish you for noticing the truth. The first truck stopped near the dock's edge. Men jumped down, heavy boots biting into snow, and began unloading with the confident efficiency of people who believed no one was watching. They pried open a section beneath the logs and revealed dull gray containers wrapped and sealed, the kind that didn't belong in honest commerce. Eli inhaled through his teeth. "Lead-lined," he murmured, recognizing the look like a mechanic, recognizing a sabotage job. "They're hiding something that talks if scanned." Brooke's mouth tightened. "Not just contraband," she whispered. "Evidence of who pays them." Jet's ears angled forward at the subtle change in her voice, as if he could smell the word betrayal. Mason kept filming, and he hated how familiar it felt, the way good men always ended up crouched in cold places, collecting proof like coins that might buy justice later if the cashier wasn't already bribed. A new vehicle arrived, an SUV too clean for a logging dock, black paint swallowing light, tires whispering over snow like it didn't want witnesses. The driver stepped out, and the night seemed to stiffen around him. Warden Caleb Voss moved toward the trucks with a calm that didn't belong in wilderness. Mid-40s, lean, trimmed beard, uniform coat, immaculate, posture straight, as if the wind had signed a contract not to touch him. His eyes were pale and flat, the kind that made you feel inspected, not seen. He spoke to the men without raising his voice, and they obeyed anyway, which told Brooke everything she needed to know about where authority truly lived. Then a second figure emerged from the SUV's passenger side, and the title of the chapter became a prophecy fulfilled. Mayor Trent Caldwell, late 50s, tall, silver hair cut neat, face carved into friendly angles that looked trustworthy on campaign posters, walked with the relaxed dominance of a man who had spent decades being the final yes in every room. He wore an expensive charcoal overcoat, leather gloves, and a scarf tied too perfectly for someone standing in river wind. His smile was practiced warmth, the kind that made grandmothers donate to town projects and made rivals forget to check receipts. But his eyes didn't match the smile. His eyes were sharp, calculating, and tired in a way that suggested he'd learned early that poverty was a monster, and he'd sworn he'd never be eaten again, no matter who he had to feed. Brooke's stomach dropped so hard she thought it might crack the ice beneath her ribs. She'd shaken that hand at parades. She'd watched him pin medals on high school volunteers and talk about community. And here he was, standing beside sealed containers under cut logs like it was just another civic project. Mason's breath went slow and steady, the way it always did right before a fight. Bear's body went rigid, not aggressive, just ready. Two Cerberus of the snowbound underworld, Bear and Jet both, guardians at the gate where human lies tried to pass as normal commerce. Brooke whispered, barely audible, "That's him. That's the voice." Mason didn't ask how she knew. The way her pupils tightened told him the answer lived in her bones. Below, Voss glanced toward the tree line, as if he felt the stare of truth like a cold needle on his neck. His gaze swept, passed near their hiding spot and slid on, almost. Then Voss spoke with quiet disgust, and even at a distance his words carried enough to freeze blood. "She should have died in that cave," he said, voice flat. "Less complicated." Caldwell's smile thinned. "Complications are expensive," the mayor replied. "Clean it up." Brooke's throat burned with a sound she refused to let out. Jet let out a low, controlled growl that never reached full volume, more a vow than a threat, and Bear shifted closer to Mason's leg, anchoring him, reminding him with that old canine truth: do the job that needs doing, not the job that feels good. Mason held up 2 fingers. Brooke understood. Stay quiet, stay alive, stay thinking. He tapped the micro SD in his pocket, then pointed to Jet's collar. Brooke's brows knit. Mason whispered, "Switch." Brooke's heart punched once. It was a cruel little magic trick, and all the best survival plans were, you took what the enemy expected, and you turned it into a decoy. Brooke pulled the card from its hidden sleeve in her belt and slid it into a tiny waterproof capsule attached beneath Jet's collar, something she'd carried for dog ID and emergency meds, never expecting it would become a vault. Jet didn't flinch. He simply stood, offended by the idea that humans needed to fumble with fate in the first place. Mason took Brooke's empty sleeve, now the evidence slot, and tucked a dummy chip inside, an old memory card Eli had in his kit, then stuffed it into a small black pouch. Eli's lips twitched despite pain. "I always knew my junk drawer would save democracy," he whispered. Mason's eyes stayed on the dock. "Now we send," he said. Eli fished a battered satellite messenger from inside his jacket, a mechanic's lifeline for remote tow calls, upgraded with the kind of paranoia that kept men alive. He had a contact stored under a single initial, R. He didn't explain who it was. He didn't need to. He compressed the clearest video clip, Caldwell's face, Voss's posture, the containers under logs, and transmitted it in a tight burst. No local signal, no county dispatch, no friendly microphone, for a mole to lick. The device beeped once, soft as a prayer. Sent. Brooke shut her eyes for a heartbeat, grief and relief colliding. She didn't want this kind of victory. She wanted a world where she could trust her badge. But the gods rarely gave people the world they wanted. They gave them the world they had to redeem. The problem was, truth makes noise even when you whisper it. One of the dockmen turned suddenly, flashlight slicing up the ridge line, and the beam caught Jet's eyes for a fraction of a second. A shout snapped the night. "There!" Mason's hand moved, fast and quiet. He tossed the black pouch, dummy evidence, into open snow and kicked it downhill so it skidded and bounced like a fleeing animal. The men lunged toward it like starving wolves chasing the wrong scent. Brooke grabbed Jet's harness, whispering into his ear, "Stay." Jet's body shook with restraint, which was its own kind of bravery. Bear moved first with Mason, not running straight, but angling through shadows, using trees like pillars in a temple of pursuit. Below, Voss barked orders. Caldwell didn't shout. Caldwell simply lifted his phone and spoke one sentence in a calm voice, and that calmness was the most terrifying thing of all, because it meant the chaos was planned. Engines roared, headlights flared, snowmobiles and trucks surged, carving the night into moving beams and rage. The chase ignited like a myth rewritten in modern steel. Men with machines hunting 4 figures and 2 dogs through a forest that did not care who deserved to win. Mason led them along the river's edge, where ice lay thick in places and dangerously thin in others. "We don't fight them on land," he murmured. "We make the river argue." Brooke's breath hitched. "You're going to break the ice." "Not under them," Mason answered, already choosing angles. "Beside them." He wasn't trying to kill. He was trying to buy time. Time for the evidence to reach someone who couldn't be bought with town money smiles. They cut across a side lane as one logging truck peeled out to block them. Mason grabbed Brooke's sleeve and yanked her toward a patch of ice that looked solid but wasn't. Snow drifted thin over moving water. He threw a rock hard into the surface, testing it. The ice answered with a deep, hollow crack, like a drum being struck in a funeral procession. Mason nodded once. He pointed Bear to circle. Bear moved without hesitation, sprinting wide, dragging attention like a shadow with teeth. Jet stayed with Brooke, shoulder brushing her thigh to keep her upright when her injured shoulder screamed. Eli stumbled, and for a second Panic tried to grab Mason by the collar. Mason refused it. He hooked Eli's arm, hauling him forward. "If you die," Eli wheezed, trying to joke through pain, "I'm haunting your cabin for the rest of your life." Mason muttered, "Get in line." The logging truck hit a turn too fast, tires slipping on glare ice, and Mason did the one thing predators never expect prey to do. He stepped toward the danger, waved his arms, made himself visible, and then vanished sideways behind a bank at the last second. The driver overcorrected. The truck's rear swung, and its weight slid onto the thin patch Mason had chosen. The ice groaned like a giant waking up angry. For one breath, everything paused. Headlights, snow, men shouting. And then the surface gave. Not the whole truck, not a dramatic plunge to doom, but the rear axle dropped into black water with a violent splash, freezing spray rising like thrown glass. The truck lurched, stuck, engine screaming. Men leaped off, swearing, scrambling for rope and chains. Mason used that chaos like a doorway. He pulled Brooke and Eli into the trees, Bear rejoining them on a silent arc, Jet last, eyes locked on the dockmen as if memorizing their sins for later. Above the river, Voss's voice rang out, furious, and for the first time his mask cracked enough for Brooke to hear fear inside it. Caldwell stood farther back, phone to ear, still too calm, too smooth. That calmness told Mason the final fight wouldn't be fists on ice. It would be evidence against power, truth against a man who thought he owned the town story. They disappeared into the evergreens while engines bogged and men yelled, and the river kept swallowing sound like it had been doing since before any of them were born. Brooke's lungs burned. Her shoulder flared white-hot. Her faith in her badge lay shattered somewhere behind her. Yet the smallest seed of something new took root anyway. Chosen trust. She looked at Mason's profile. Hard jaw, short hair threaded with gray. Eyes that had learned to stay calm while the world screamed. And she realized he wasn't saving her because he wanted to be a hero. He was saving her because the old oath inside him had been disturbed and refused to die. She glanced down at Jet's collar, where the real proof rode hidden against fur and heartbeat, and she almost laughed at the absurd holiness of it. The truth wasn't in a courthouse tonight. It was strapped to a dog who'd survived fire and still had the nerve to sneeze at fate. Mason raised a fist, stopping them in a pocket of dense fur where wind died and sound could be controlled. He listened. Bear listened. Jet listened. Even Eli listened, grimacing like listening hurt more than the bullet graze. Far behind, the chaos at the river dock faded into angry distance. Mason leaned close and spoke the next step like a vow. "The mask fell," he murmured. "Now we make sure the world sees the face." And with that, they moved again, into winter, into danger, into the hard, strange mercy of a story that refused to let evil end the sentence. Snow quit falling sometime after midnight, not out of kindness, but because even storms get tired of talking. The forest around Pine Ridge went still in that dangerous way, quiet like a held breath, quiet like a courtroom before the verdict. Mason Reed guided Brooke Carter, Eli Parker, and the two canines into a fold of terrain where sound died fast. A narrow basin of fur and rock that funneled wind overhead and kept footprints shallow. He moved with the slow patience of a man who had learned that survival was not speed, it was timing. Worn brown leather jacket creaking at the elbows, red and black plaid flannel dark against the snow, tall lace-up boots planted like stakes. Bear stayed close, 9 years old, and built for restraint, black and tan coat frosted along the spine, eyes steady as if counting debts the world still owed his handler. Jet, younger and sharper at 6, matched Brooks' pace like a living brace, athletic frame trembling only when he stopped, because stopping meant listening, and listening meant remembering firewood stacked in a cave like a funeral pyre. Brooks' shoulder burned each time she raised her arm, the hang-time injury arguing with her will. Still, her posture stayed upright, because her pride had teeth. Eli limped, the grays wound under his layers reminding him that friendship often came with a receipt. He tried to keep the mood from collapsing by offering dry humor to the cold, whispering that if they survived, he'd open a shop that sold anti-corruption mufflers for town officials. Bear gave him a slow look that said, in fluent dog, that human jokes were rarely funny, but sometimes necessary, like bandages. They didn't sleep much. Mason never truly did. He dozed in fragments, eyes open more than shut, listening for engines that might cut the woods like blades. When the first hint of dawn diluted the black sky into pewter, Brooks' powered-down phone buzzed once in her pocket, one short vibration like fate tapping glass. Mason's hand lifted instantly, palm out. Stop. Brooks' breath caught. She didn't want technology to speak again. She'd seen how a whisper through a device could summon hunters faster than prayer. But the vibration wasn't a ping from a tower. It was the satellite messenger Eli had tucked inside his jacket, the same battered brick that had carried their video beyond the town's corrupt veins. Eli fished it out with stiff fingers, squinting. A single letter stared back from the screen. R. Then a message, clipped and clean. Hold. State units en route. Do not return to town. River dock compromised. Send visual if safe. Brooke let out a breath that trembled. Not fear, not relief, but the strange grief of realizing that help existed, just not where she'd been taught to look. Mason didn't smile. He simply nodded once, as if he'd expected the world to be complicated and had planned his heart accordingly. R's real, Eli whispered. I told you my junk drawer would save democracy. Mason murmured, quiet, but his tone carried the faintest trace of amusement, thin sunlight in a long winter. The contact behind that letter arrived an hour later, not with sirens that announced themselves to everyone who shouldn't hear, but with the disciplined subtlety of professionals who'd learned that corruption listened. 2 dark SUVs appeared first, crawling up an old service road with lights off, tires chewing softly through crusted snow. Then a third vehicle, heavier, followed at distance. From the lead SUV stepped Captain Rowan Hale of Oregon State Police, mid-40s, tall and straight-backed, black hair pulled into a tight braid that sat like a rope of control down her collar, skin olive-toned and wind-chapped, eyes dark and awake in a way that suggested she didn't waste time on denial. Her face carried a narrow scar near the jawline, faint but visible when dawn caught it, the kind of mark that came from a moment when someone else tried to write the ending for her. She wore a layered winter uniform under a hardshell parka, gloves clipped to her belt, and her voice, when she spoke, was calm enough to be unsettling. Behind her moved 4 troopers in winter gear, with long guns slung but pointed down, posture alert without theatrical aggression. Rowan's gaze swept the group, Mason's stance, Brooks' injuries, Eli's pallor, the dog's controlled readiness, and then she looked directly at Brooke. Officer Carter, she said, using the title like a promise instead of a chain. I'm Rowan Hale. Your file said you were stubborn. It didn't mention you were correct. Brooke's throat tightened. She didn't cry. She almost laughed instead, the way people did when the gods finally admitted, quietly, that you weren't crazy. Mason stood half a step forward, not threatening, just present. Rowan's eyes flicked to his jacket, to the set of his shoulders, to the way Bear's body aligned with him like a shadow with teeth. "And your read," Rowan said, as if reading a page she'd already studied. "Retired Navy SEAL." Mason's jaw tightened. "Retired," he confirmed. Rowan didn't press. She simply nodded once, and Mason recognized that nod, professional respect without intrusion. "You sent video," Rowan continued, turning to Eli. "Good. You also bought yourselves a clock." Her gaze moved toward the river's direction, where faint engine echoes still lived in the distance. "Caldwell and Voss won't sit still once they realize someone outside town saw their faces." Brooke's stomach dropped again. "They'll burn," she said softly, the word tasting like ash. "They'll try," Rowan corrected, "but we're going to make fire testify instead." Mason angled his head. "How?" Rowan gestured to a folded map on her hood. "We intercepted chatter on a private frequency," she said. "Not county, not local. A commercial channel. Someone's moving to the abandoned mill, your old saw station, the one you hit earlier." She looked at Mason, eyes sharp. "They'll try to destroy ledgers, serial records, shipping schedules. They'll also try to recover the bodies they think they left in that cave." Brooke's spine went cold. Jet's ears snapped forward, and a low sound vibrated in his chest, a vow that said he would not hang on anyone's mercy again. Bear leaned closer to Mason, anchoring him. Eli swallowed. "So we go now," Mason said. Rowan nodded. "We go now," she agreed. "But we go like winter, quiet, inevitable." The plan wasn't heroic. It was methodical. Bordeaux. 2 troopers with Rowan cutting wide to the mill's north side, using the tree line. Another pair circling to the south to block the service road. Mason, Brooke, and the dogs holding in the timber where they could see the loading yard without being seen. Eli, wounded and stubborn, tried to insist on coming until Rowan gave him a look that could freeze water. "You're useful alive," she said. "That's an order from someone you've never met but should listen to." Eli muttered something about bossy angels and allowed a trooper to wrap his wound tighter and keep him behind with the 3rd vehicle. Brooke shifted her weight, testing her shoulder. Pain flashed across her face like a shadow. Rowan saw it and didn't pity her. "You can stay back," Rowan offered, not soft, simply realistic. Brooke's jaw set. "If Voss is burning my case," she said, "I'm watching him do it." Rowan studied her for a beat, then nodded. "Then do it smart." They moved through timber until the mill emerged, rotting buildings hunched under snow like broken teeth, stacked logs half buried, a corrugated metal shed that looked empty until you noticed the fresh tire tracks cutting the white like a confession. Headlights flickered inside the yard. Men moved fast, silhouettes carrying boxes, dragging tarps, tossing papers into a metal barrel. Flame licked up, small at first, then greedy. Mason felt something old in his ribcage respond, the part of him that hated fire not as an element, but as an eraser. Brooke lifted her phone in airplane mode and began recording, hands steady now, because rage had found a purpose. Jet stood beside her, body tight, eyes locked on the figures. Bear crouched with Mason, calm as a temple guardian. Rowan's voice murmured over a throat mic, "Confirm Voss." Mason scanned. He found him near the shed, Caleb Voss, lean and controlled, even in panic, beard neat, uniform coat open, gloved hands shoving binders into the barrel. Firelight painted his face orange, making him look like the kind of man who mistook power for righteousness. Then another figure strode into view from a black SUV, Mayor Trent Caldwell, silver hair bright under flame glow, expensive coat flapping as he moved, jaw tight, voice sharp enough to cut. Brooks' heart turned to ice. Caldwell grabbed Voss by the sleeve and spoke in angry fragments, not caring who heard, because men like him always believed the world was trained to look away. "Faster," he snapped. "If State gets wind—" Voss jerked his arm free. "We already have wind," he hissed. "She's alive." Caldwell's head whipped, scanning the tree line. Brooke froze. For one awful heartbeat, she thought he could see her soul through branches. Then Rowan's voice, calm and absolute, sliced through the yard from a concealed speaker position. "Caleb Voss, Trent Caldwell, step away from the fire, hands where we can see them." The yard didn't explode into chaos the way movies lied. It did something worse. It revealed character. Voss hesitated, calculating exits. Caldwell tried to smile, that old politician reflex. "This is a misunderstanding," Caldwell called, voice too warm for the scene. "We're securing—" Rowan stepped into view then, controlled and steady, troopers flanking her, weapons down but ready. "You're destroying evidence," Rowan said. "And you're done." Caldwell's smile cracked. Voss moved first, not toward the troopers, but toward the shed door, toward a vehicle, toward escape. That was the moment Mason gave a small hand signal. Bear launched, not like a reckless wolf, but like a disciplined verdict. Black and tan body, a silent arrow across snow. Jet followed Brooks' command with equal precision, sprinting to cut off the angle, his bark sharp and singular, not frantic, an alarm bell, not a tantrum. Voss stumbled back, boots sliding on icy slush, and Bear intercepted him at the forearm with a controlled bite that forced the man's hand open. A set of keys clattered into snow. Jet circled, teeth bared, herding Voss away from the door like a mythic hound guarding the gate of consequence. Voss yelled, more insulted than hurt, and tried to swing his elbow. Bear released instantly on Mason's second signal, retreating half a step, eyes locked, ready to re-engage if necessary. Troopers closed in and pinned Voss, cuffing him with a clean metallic click that sounded louder than the fire. Caldwell backed away, palms raised, trying to maintain dignity, like dignity could act as armor. "I'll have your badge," he snapped at Rowan, voice trembling with outrage. Rowan's eyes didn't blink. "You can file a complaint from a holding cell," she said. Brooke stepped out then, into the open, snow under her boots, phone camera still rolling. Her face was pale, freckles stark, eyes like greenish flint. She didn't shout. She didn't beg. She spoke one sentence with a calm that came from surviving a stake meant for burning. "You told them to erase me." Caldwell's gaze snapped to her, and the mask finally fell all the way. Contempt flashed. "You should have stayed obedient," he said, and in that single line he confessed more than any ledger. Brooks' throat tightened. Rowan turned slightly. "Captain," Brooks said quietly, "I have video, and I have chain. Satellite transmission time-stamped." Rowan nodded. "Good," she said. "Fire can't eat that." The barrel still burned, pages curling and blackening like dead moth wings. A trooper doused it with foam, steam rising into dawn, like a last prayer, leaving a corrupt altar. The arrests were swift after that. Voss taken first, then Caldwell, who kept trying to speak until Rowan cut him off with procedure and cuffs. Dawn did what dawn always did. It arrived without applause, painting the snow clean, not because the world had become pure, but because light did not negotiate with darkness. Hours later, after evidence was cataloged and statements taken, Rowan allowed Mason and Brooke to retreat to Mason's cabin while troopers secured the perimeter and collected what the fire hadn't consumed. Mason stood on his porch again, the same worn leather jacket on his shoulders, the same plaid beneath, but his eyes less icy than they'd been at the beginning of this story, as if someone had turned a dimmer switch inside him from hide to hold. Bear lay down at his boots with a long exhale that sounded like an old god finally permitting himself rest. Jet curled against Brooke's leg, and Brooke, exhausted, shoulders bandaged, wrapped her arms around his neck and let out a laugh that rasped like she'd just finished crying. Bear and Jet's shoulders touched, fur meeting fur, a silent oath between working dogs who had been treated like trophies and chose instead to become guardians. Brooke stared out at Pine Ridge, and her voice was soft when she spoke, not because she was weak, but because the truth had humbled her. "I thought the law was a shield," she said. Mason looked at the tree line, at the pale sky beyond. "Law's a tool," he answered. "People decide how it's used." Brooke nodded slowly. "Then I choose people," she said, and the sentence felt like a new religion, smaller than naive faith, harder earned, and far more durable. Rowan's unit didn't hand out medals. They handed out paperwork, subpoenas, the slow machinery of justice that didn't look cinematic but changed lives. And somewhere under that ordinary weight, something close to grace moved, not fireworks, not a perfect system, but the stubborn miracle of survivors refusing to let fire write the final chapter. The miracle in this story isn't that the snow stopped falling, or that evil suddenly learned manners. The miracle is quieter, and that's how God often works. It's the moment a man who tried to bury his heart under years of winter still steps out of the shadows to protect someone he's never met. It's two dogs who were tied up like trophies, standing again, shoulder to shoulder, like old sentinels saying without words, "No one gets left behind." And it's dawn arriving not with fireworks, but with steady light, proof that darkness never gets the final signature. In everyday life, most people won't face a cave and a burning stake. But everyone knows a personal winter, a betrayal that stings, a hard diagnosis, a lonely season, a broken promise, bills that stack higher than hope. And the lesson stays the same. When you can't fix the whole world, be faithful in your corner of it. Don't carry fire home just because someone once tried to burn you. Choose what's right, even when your hands are shaking. Sometimes God doesn't remove the storm right away. Sometimes He gives the strength to take one brave step inside it and to become shelter for someone else. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. And if you've ever witnessed a quiet miracle in your own life, we'd love to read it. Please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story of loyalty, faith, and courage. And before you go, let's pray together. May God bless you and keep you. May He guard your home, your loved ones, and every faithful companion who walks beside you. May He heal the wounds nobody sees, steady your heart when the night feels long, and give you courage that chooses love over fear. May His peace rest on you like dawn, quiet, certain, and new. Amen.